the darkness of a military detention cell, they thought breaking her would be as simple as taking away what made her feel human. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that beneath the shaved head and prison uniform sat someone whose true identity would shake the very foundation of their assumptions about power, rank, and respect. This is the story of Captain Elena Rodriguez, whose journey from decorated officer to wrongfully imprisoned soldier would expose the deepest flaws in a system that forgot one crucial truth. Sometimes the person you're trying to destroy is exactly the person who holds your fate in their hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Elena Rodriguez walked through the corridors she had called home for the past 8 years. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, and her dark hair pulled back in regulation style. She had no idea that in less than 6 hours, everything she had worked for would crumble around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. Elena had always been different from her peers. While other officers relied on family connections or political maneuvering to advance their careers, she had climbed the ranks through sheer determination and exceptional skill. Born in a small town on the Mexican border, she was the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children a better life. Her father worked double shifts at a factory, and her mother cleaned offices at night. Also, Elena and her younger brother could attend good schools and dream bigger than their circumstances suggested possible. The military had been Elena's escape route and her calling. She excelled in strategy, showed natural leadership abilities, and earned the respect of both subordinates and superiors through her fair treatment and tactical brilliance. Her record was spotless, decorated with commendations for service in 3 different combat zones where she had saved countless lives through her quick thinking and brave actions. But success in the military, Elena had learned, sometimes came with enemies. Colonel Marcus Brennan had been watching her rise with growing resentment. A man who believed promotions should follow traditional paths and that certain positions weren't meant for people like Elena. He had been passed over for a promotion that many believed should have gone to him. A promotion that instead went to a younger officer who happened to be Elena's mentor, General Patricia Hayes. Brennan had spent months looking for a way to bring Elena down. His opportunity came, disguised as a routine mission that would take Elena's unit into hostile territory to gather intelligence on enemy positions. What Elena didn't know was that Brennan had been feeding false information to enemy forces, setting up a trap that would make it look like Elena had betrayed her own unit. The mission went wrong from the moment they crossed into enemy territory. Elena's unit was ambushed at precisely the location Brennan had leaked to enemy operatives. 3 soldiers died in the initial attack, and Elena herself was wounded while trying to evacuate her team. Despite her injuries, she managed to lead the survivors to safety, carrying Private Johnson on her back for 2 miles through rough terrain while enemy fire echoed behind them. When they finally reached the extraction point, Elena thought the worst was over. She was wrong. Instead of being treated as a hero who had saved lives under impossible circumstances, she was immediately placed under arrest. The charges were devastating: treason, conspiracy with enemy forces, and negligent homicide of the 3 soldiers who had died in the ambush. The evidence against her had been carefully crafted. Encrypted communications that appeared to show Elena providing intelligence to enemy forces, though she had never seen these messages before. Financial records suggesting she had received payments from foreign accounts, though she had no knowledge of any such transactions. Witness testimonies from soldiers who claimed they had seen Elena acting suspiciously in the weeks leading up to the mission, though Elena remembered no such interactions. As Elena sat in the interrogation room, still wearing her blood-stained uniform from the mission, she couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The investigating officer, Major Thompson, laid out the evidence with cold efficiency. Each piece of supposed proof felt like a physical blow. Elena's protests of innocence were met with skepticism and barely concealed disdain. "Captain Rodriguez," Major Thompson said, his voice cutting through the sterile air of the interrogation room, "the evidence is overwhelming. Your best option is to confess and cooperate with our investigation. It might help reduce your sentence." Elena looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady, despite the chaos raging inside her mind. "Sir, I have served this country with honor for 8 years. I have never betrayed my oath, my unit, or my fellow soldiers. I don't know how this evidence came to exist, but I swear to you that I am innocent of these charges." Major Thompson's expression didn't change. He had heard similar denials from other accused soldiers, and in his experience, they usually crumbled within a few hours once they realized the weight of the evidence against them. He didn't believe Elena was any different, despite her previously sterling record. The news of Elena's arrest spread through the base like wildfire. Soldiers who had served under her command couldn't believe the charges. She had always been the officer who made sure her soldiers had proper equipment, who visited wounded men in the hospital, who remembered birthdays and family problems. The idea that she would betray them seemed impossible. But the military justice system operates differently from civilian courts. The presumption of innocence becomes harder to maintain when classified evidence is involved, and when the survival of military operations depends on quick, decisive action. Elena's commanding officers, under pressure to show they were taking the matter seriously, made the decision to confine her immediately pending a full investigation. Elena's lawyer, Captain David Chen, was a competent military attorney, but he was overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the seeming strength of the evidence against his client. During their first meeting, he was frank about her prospects. "Elena, I've reviewed the preliminary evidence, and I have to be honest with you. This looks very bad. The prosecution has communications, financial records, and witness testimony. Unless we can find significant problems with their evidence, you're looking at life in prison, possibly even a death sentence for treason." Elena felt the world spinning around her. Life in prison? Death sentence? For crimes she hadn't committed. For betraying soldiers she would have died to protect. The injustice of it was overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain calm. "David, I know how this looks, but I'm telling you that I'm innocent. Someone has set me up, and we need to find out who and why." Captain Chen nodded, though Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. He had heard similar claims from other clients, most of whom had indeed been guilty of the charges against them. But something about Elena's case nagged at him. Her record was too perfect, her reputation too solid, for this to be a simple case of corruption or betrayal. As Elena was led from the legal office to her temporary holding cell, she caught sight of Colonel Brennan talking with a group of officers near the building entrance. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Elena saw something in his expression that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't surprise or disappointment at her arrest. It was satisfaction. The look of a man whose carefully laid plans were coming to fruition. That night, alone in her cell, Elena tried to piece together what had happened. She reviewed every detail of the mission, every conversation leading up to it, every person who had access to their operational plans. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that someone with high-level access and detailed knowledge of their procedures would have been needed to orchestrate such an elaborate frame-up. Elena had always been taught that the military was a brotherhood, a family where soldiers looked out for each other regardless of rank or background. She had believed in that ideal, had built her career around it. Now, lying on the narrow cot in her cell, she began to understand that for some people, that brotherhood had boundaries she had never imagined.
The next morning brought news that would make her situation even worse.
General Patricia Hayes, her mentor and one of the few people Elena trusted completely, was being recalled to Washington for an urgent assignment. Elena wouldn't see her again for months, and without Hayes' protection and advocacy, Elena would be completely at the mercy of officers who already viewed her with suspicion and hostility. As Elena was processed into the military detention facility, she maintained her dignity and her protestations of innocence. She answered questions honestly, cooperated with searches, and tried to maintain the bearing of the officer she had always been. But she could see in the eyes of the guards and administrators that they had already judged her guilty. To them, she was no longer Captain Rodriguez, decorated combat veteran. She was just another prisoner who had betrayed her oath and gotten soldiers killed. The facility where Elena was held was designed to break down the psychological defenses of prisoners. The constant noise, irregular meal times, arbitrary rule changes, and lack of privacy were all calculated to wear down resistance and force confessions. Elena recognized the techniques from her own training in resistance to interrogation, but recognizing them and resisting them were two very different things. Elena's first week in detention was a continuous assault on her sense of self. She was stripped of her uniform, her insignia, and anything else that marked her as an officer. Her personal possessions were confiscated, including a watch that had been a gift from her father and a small cross her mother had given her before her first deployment. These items, worthless to anyone else, had been touchstones that connected her to her identity and her values. The other prisoners in the facility were a mix of soldiers awaiting court-martial for various offenses, from desertion to assault to financial crimes. Most viewed Elena with suspicion because of the serious nature of her charges. Accusations of treason marked her as someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who had betrayed the very foundations of military service. Elena tried to maintain her daily routines as much as possible within the constraints of prison life. She exercised in her cell, reviewed military regulations from memory, and tried to prepare for the legal battle that lay ahead. But each day brought new challenges to her mental and emotional stability. The guards seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding Elena of her fall from grace. Comments about how the mighty have fallen and speculation about whether she would face execution were constant reminders that her previous rank and reputation meant nothing in this environment. Elena forced herself not to respond to these provocations, knowing that any sign of weakness or anger would only make her situation worse. Elena's family was notified of her arrest through official channels, but they were given little information about the charges or the evidence against her. Her parents, who had always been so proud of their daughter's military service, struggled to understand how their Elena could be accused of such terrible crimes. Her younger brother Miguel, who had followed Elena's example and enlisted in the army, found himself facing questions and suspicion from his own unit because of his sister's alleged crimes.
The isolation was perhaps the hardest part for Elena to endure.
She had always been someone who drew strength from relationships with others, from her connections to her soldiers, her mentors, and her family. Now she found herself cut off from everyone who had mattered to her, surrounded by people who viewed her as a traitor and a criminal. As Elena's second week in detention began, she received word that her preliminary hearing had been scheduled. This would be her first opportunity to hear the full evidence against her and to begin mounting her defense. Captain Chen warned her that preliminary hearings in cases involving classified information were largely formalities, designed more to establish the strength of the prosecution's case than to provide meaningful opportunities for the defense. Elena prepared for the hearing with the same meticulous attention to detail she had brought to military operations. She reviewed every piece of evidence she had been allowed to see, made notes on inconsistencies and questions she wanted her lawyer to pursue, and tried to present herself as the professional officer she had always been. The hearing was held in a secure conference room at the base legal office. Elena, wearing a standard prisoner's uniform rather than her military dress uniform, sat beside Captain Chen as the prosecution laid out their case. The evidence was even more damaging than Elena had expected. The communications supposedly showing her contact with enemy agents were detailed and appeared to show extensive planning for the attack that had killed her soldiers. As Elena listened to the prosecution's presentation, she felt a growing sense of desperation. The evidence was so comprehensive, so perfectly crafted to show her guilt, that she began to doubt whether anyone would ever believe her claims of innocence. The financial records showed payments that exactly matched the dates of supposed intelligence transfers. The witness testimonies corroborated each other in ways that suggested a carefully coordinated effort. But something about the very perfection of the case against her began to give Elena hope. Real conspiracies, she knew from her intelligence training, were usually messy affairs with loose ends and inconsistencies. The case against her was too neat, too perfectly packaged. Someone had spent considerable time and effort constructing this frame-up, and that suggested they had something significant to hide. Elena's resolve began to strengthen as she listened to the charges against her. She would fight these accusations with every tool at her disposal, not just to clear her own name, but to expose whoever had orchestrated this betrayal. She owed that much to the soldiers who had died, to the family that believed in her, and to the oath she had taken to defend her country. As the hearing concluded and Elena was led back to her cell, she caught sight of Colonel Brennan again. This time she was watching for his reaction, and she saw something that confirmed her growing suspicions. He wasn't watching the proceedings with the interest of someone seeking justice. He was watching with the satisfaction of someone seeing his plans succeed. Elena realized that her fight was just beginning. She had fallen from the heights of military success to the depths of accusation and disgrace, but she was far from defeated. Somewhere in the evidence against her, in the web of lies and false documents, there had to be a thread that would lead back to the truth. She would find it, no matter how long it took or what she had to endure. The system had underestimated Captain Elena Rodriguez once before, when they assumed she couldn't rise through the ranks based on merit alone. Now they were underestimating her again, assuming that prison walls and false charges would be enough to break her spirit. They were about to learn, as Elena was about to learn herself, that some people are forged stronger in the fires of injustice than they ever were in the comfort of success. 3 months into her imprisonment, Elena had learned to navigate the brutal hierarchy of military detention with the same strategic thinking she had once applied to combat operations. But nothing could have prepared her for the morning when Warden Colonel Sarah Mitchell made the announcement that would test every ounce of her remaining resolve. Elena was in the middle of her daily exercise routine, doing push-ups in the cramped space of her cell, when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple guards approaching. The metallic jangle of keys and the synchronized footsteps meant official business, and Elena had learned to brace herself for whatever new humiliation the system had devised for her. Colonel Mitchell stood in the doorway, a woman whose career had been built on breaking down soldiers who thought they were tougher than the system. She was flanked by 2 guards and held a clipboard that Elena instinctively knew contained orders that would make her already difficult situation worse. Mitchell's reputation preceded her. She had turned the detention facility into a model of efficiency. which in military terms meant she had perfected the art of psychological pressure. "Prisoner Rodriguez," Mitchell began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted her right to command others. "By order of the facility administration, you are hereby required to submit to regulation grooming standards for high-security prisoners." She knew exactly what this meant. Her hair, which had grown out during her months of detention and had become one of the few remaining connections to her identity as the woman she had been before this nightmare began, would be removed. In the military, hair regulations were about discipline and uniformity. In prison, forced grooming was about dominance and psychological control. Elena had watched this same ritual performed on other prisoners, had seen how the act of forcible grooming seemed to drain something essential from them. It wasn't just about appearance. It was about removing the last vestige of personal choice, the final symbol of individual identity that prisoners could control. Elena had managed to keep her hair by maintaining exemplary behavior and by the fact that her case was still making its way through the legal system. But someone had obviously decided that her time of relative dignity was over. Standing up slowly from her position on the floor, Elena faced Colonel Mitchell with the same steady gaze she had once used to stare down enemy snipers. "Ma'am, I request to know the specific regulation that requires this action and the reason for its implementation at this time." Mitchell's expression didn't change. She had expected resistance, had probably hoped for it. Resistance gave her the opportunity to demonstrate the futility of opposition to the system. The facility has been redesigned as high security. All prisoners in high security classifications are subject to enhanced grooming requirements for safety and security purposes. Your classification was updated this morning. Elena knew this was a lie. Her security classification hadn't changed because her case hadn't changed. This was punishment disguised as policy, humiliation wrapped in the language of regulation. But she also knew that arguing would only make the experience worse and would provide Mitchell with the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The walk to the facility barbershop felt like a death march. Other prisoners stopped their activities to watch as Elena was escorted down the corridor, and Elena could see in their faces the recognition that if this could happen to someone with her rank and reputation, it could happen to any of them. The guards beside her weren't the usual rotation she had grown accustomed to. These were Mitchell's hand-picked personnel, chosen for their loyalty to her methods and their willingness to carry out orders without question. The barbershop was a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. The chair in the center was designed more like a restraint device than furniture, with straps and metal fittings that could be used to secure uncooperative prisoners. Elena was ordered to sit, and the straps were fastened around her wrists and ankles. The message was clear. This was not a request or a standard procedure. This was a demonstration of power. The barber assigned to perform the task was a civilian contractor named Reynolds, who had been working in military facilities for over a decade. Elena could see in his eyes that he took no pleasure in what he was about to do, but she also saw that he wouldn't risk his job by showing mercy or hesitation. Reynolds had seen too many careers destroyed by moments of compassion, in a system that valued compliance over humanity. As the electric clippers buzzed to life, Elena closed her eyes and tried to transport her mind somewhere else. She thought about the mountains near her childhood home, where she and her brother used to hike on weekends. She remembered the feeling of accomplishment when she had graduated from officer training, the pride in her parents' eyes when they pinned her lieutenant's bars on her uniform. She tried to hold on to the memory of leading her soldiers through successful missions, of the trust and respect she had earned through years of honorable service. But the sensation of the clippers moving across her scalp kept dragging her back to the present. Each pass removed more than just hair. It stripped away another piece of the identity she had built over years of dedicated service. Elena had never been vain about her appearance, but her hair had been part of how she presented herself to the world as a professional, competent officer. Now it was falling to the floor in dark clumps, leaving behind only stubble and exposed scalp. The process took longer than it should have, Elena realized. Reynolds was being deliberately slow, following orders to make the humiliation last as long as possible. Every few minutes he would pause to clean the clippers or adjust the settings, prolonging Elena's time in the chair and giving the watching guards more opportunity to observe her degradation. Elena forced herself to keep her eyes closed and her breathing steady. She would not give Mitchell the satisfaction of seeing her cry or beg. She would not let this moment define her or break her spirit. But even as she maintained her outward composure, Elena felt something fundamental shifting inside her. The woman who had walked into this room was not the same woman who would walk out. When Reynolds finally finished and unstrapped her from the chair, Elena caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. The reflection was shocking. Without her hair, her face looked thinner, her features sharper. The woman in the mirror looked like a prisoner, a criminal, someone who belonged in this place. Elena forced herself to look directly into her own eyes, to find some recognition of the person she knew herself to be. Colonel Mitchell had stayed to observe the entire procedure, and Elena could see the satisfaction in her expression as she looked at the transformation. This was exactly the psychological impact Mitchell had been hoping for. Stripped of her hair, Elena looked defeated, broken down, ready to accept whatever the system demanded of her. "Much better," Mitchell said, her tone carrying a note of approval that made Elena's skin crawl. "You look more appropriate for your current situation, Prisoner Rodriguez. Perhaps this will help you adjust your attitude about cooperation with the ongoing investigation." Elena turned to face Mitchell directly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "My attitude about cooperation has not changed, ma'am. I maintain my innocence and my commitment to the truth, regardless of my appearance." Mitchell's expression hardened. She had expected this defiance to be broken by now, had assumed that the combination of isolation, humiliation, and psychological pressure would have worn down Elena's resistance. The fact that Elena continued to maintain her innocence and dignity was both frustrating and impressive. As Elena was escorted back to her cell, she became aware of how dramatically her appearance had changed the way others looked at her. Guards who had previously shown her a grudging respect now treated her with open contempt. Other prisoners who had maintained careful distance because of her officer status now looked at her as just another broken convict. The psychological impact was exactly what the system had intended. Elena caught herself hunching her shoulders, trying to hide her exposed neck and scalp. She found herself avoiding eye contact with others, not because she felt guilty, but because the shame of her appearance had become overwhelming. For the first time since her arrest, Elena began to understand how the process of incarceration was designed to destroy not just a person's freedom, but their fundamental sense of self-worth. That night, Elena lay in her cell and ran her hands over her shaved head, feeling the unfamiliar stubble where her hair had been. The sensation was alien and uncomfortable, a constant reminder of her powerlessness within the system. Every time she moved, every time she turned her head, she was reminded of what had been taken from her. But as the initial shock began to wear off, Elena found herself thinking about the deeper meaning of what had happened. The system had taken her hair because they believed it would break her spirit. They had removed this symbol of her femininity and professional identity because they thought it would make her more willing to confess to crimes she hadn't committed. In other words, they were afraid of her continued resistance. Elena began to see her shaved head not as a symbol of defeat, but as evidence that her refusal to confess was having an impact. If the prosecution was confident in their case, if they truly believed the evidence against her was overwhelming, why would they need to resort to psychological warfare? The fact that they were trying to break her spirit suggested that her spirit was still intact enough to threaten them. Elena's case had been assigned to military judge Colonel Robert Harrison, a man known for his strict adherence to military law and his intolerance for procedural irregularities. Harrison had served in Vietnam and had built his career on the principle that military justice should be both swift and fair. He had a reputation for being harder on prosecutors who cut corners than on defendants who maintained their innocence. Captain Chen had been working around the clock to prepare Elena's defense, but he was fighting an uphill battle against evidence that seemed to prove guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. However, Chen had begun to notice small inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that suggested more investigation was needed. The timing of some of the alleged communications didn't match with Elena's known whereabouts. The financial records, while convincing at first glance, showed patterns that didn't fit with Elena's known spending habits or financial sophistication. During one of their meetings, Chen shared his growing suspicions with Elena. "I think someone with significant access to military intelligence systems had to be involved in creating this evidence. The level of detail and the integration with real systems is too sophisticated for an outside operation." This looks like an inside job. Elena had been thinking along the same lines, but hearing it from her lawyer gave her hope that they might be able to prove her innocence. "David, I've been thinking about who had access to all the information that would be needed to set me up like this. It's a very short list and Colonel Brennan is at the top of it." Chen nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about Brennan too. He had motive, means, and opportunity. But proving it is going to be incredibly difficult. He's covered his tracks well, and he has friends in high places who would be reluctant to believe accusations against him." Elena's spirits began to lift for the first time in months. She wasn't alone in her fight anymore. Chen believed in her innocence and was working to expose the truth. but she also knew that they were up against powerful forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy lives, to protect themselves. Elena's parents had been trying to visit her since her arrest, but the classification of her cases involving state secrets had limited family contact to brief phone calls monitored by security personnel. When Elena's mother finally received permission to visit, the shock of seeing her daughter's shaved head and prison uniform was devastating. Maria Rodriguez had raised her daughter to be proud and strong, and seeing Elena reduced to this state brought tears that Elena hadn't seen since her father's heart attack years earlier. During their brief visit, Maria spoke in the mix of Spanish and English that had been the language of Elena's childhood.
Mija, we know you didn't do these things. Your father and I, we know our daughter.
But seeing you like this, Maria's voice broke, and she reached across the table as if to touch Elena's face, before remembering that physical contact wasn't allowed. Elena forced herself to smile, to project strength she didn't entirely feel.
Mama, I'm okay. They can change how I look, but they can't change who I am inside. We're going to prove my innocence. Captain Chen is working hard, and there are people who still believe in me.
But even as Elena spoke these words of reassurance to her mother, she wondered if they were true.
Each day in detention seemed to strip away another piece of her former identity. She was no longer Captain Rodriguez, respected officer and leader. She was prisoner Rodriguez, accused traitor awaiting trial. The distinction mattered more than she had expected.
Elena's brother Miguel had been investigating the charges against his sister from his position within the army. Using his access to personnel records and training databases, Miguel had discovered several irregularities in the timeline of events leading up to Elena's mission.
He had also learned that Colonel Brennan had been asking unusual questions about Elena's assignments in the weeks before her arrest. Questions that seemed designed to gather information about her vulnerabilities rather than her capabilities. Miguel's investigation had to be conducted carefully.
As Elena's brother, he was automatically suspect, and any obvious attempt to investigate the charges against her could result in his own court-martial for interfering with an ongoing case. But Miguel was determined to help his sister, and he had inherited the same stubborn courage that had driven Elena's military success.
Elena's situation took another turn for the worse when news of her case began to leak to the media. Someone, possibly within the prosecution team, had provided details about the charges to a reporter who specialized in military scandals.
The story that appeared in the national media painted Elena as a traitor who had betrayed her country for money, emphasizing the deaths of the soldiers in her unit and the classified nature of the intelligence she was accused of selling. The media coverage was devastating for Elena's family and for her chances of receiving a fair trial. Public opinion shaped by selective leaks that emphasized the most damaging aspects of the prosecution's case turned against her before she ever had a chance to present her defense.
Elena became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when the wrong people were given positions of trust and authority. Elena learned about the media coverage from other prisoners who had access to television during certain hours. The news reports showed her military photograph, alongside headlines about treason and betrayal. The woman in that photograph looked like a stranger to Elena now. A person from another life who had believed in things like honor and justice and the possibility that merit would be rewarded. Colonel Mitchell made sure that Elena was aware of every negative news report, every editorial calling for swift justice, every letter to the editor demanding her execution. This was psychological warfare at its most refined, designed to make Elena feel abandoned by the very country she had sworn to serve. But the media coverage also had an unintended consequence. General Patricia Hayes, who had been following Elena's case from her new assignment in Washington, began her own quiet investigation into the charges. Hayes had mentored Elena for years and knew her character intimately. The Elena Rodriguez she knew was incapable of the betrayal described in the charges, and Hayes was determined to find out what had really happened. Hayes's position in Washington gave her access to intelligence that wasn't available to Elena's defense team. She began reviewing the original intelligence reports from the region where Elena's unit had been attacked, looking for discrepancies between what was reported and what the evidence against Elena suggested had happened. What she found would eventually change everything, but for now, Elena continued to endure her imprisonment without knowing that help was coming from an unexpected direction. As Elena entered her 4th month in detention, the psychological toll of her situation was becoming harder to hide. The forced grooming, the constant scrutiny, the isolation from everyone who had mattered to her, and the weight of the evidence against her had worn down her defenses in ways she hadn't expected. Elena found herself questioning not just the charges against her, but her own memory of events.
Had she done something, signed something, said something that could have been misinterpreted as treasonous? This self-doubt was the most insidious weapon in the arsenal of psychological pressure being used against her. Elena had always been confident in her decisions and her memory, but months of being told she was a traitor by people in positions of authority had planted seeds of uncertainty that grew in the long, silent hours of her confinement. Elena realized that she was approaching a breaking point. The system was designed to bring prisoners to this moment, when the psychological pressure became so overwhelming that confession seemed like the only path to relief. She understood now why so many prisoners eventually confessed to crimes they hadn't committed.
The alternative, maintaining innocence in the face of overwhelming systematic pressure, required reserves of strength that most people simply didn't possess. But Elena also knew that if she broke now, if she confessed to crimes she hadn't committed, she would be betraying not just herself but every soldier who had ever trusted her leadership.
She would be validating the system that had destroyed her, and ensuring that whoever had really betrayed her unit would never face justice. As Elena sat in her cell on the night after her forced grooming, running her hands over her shaved head and contemplating the battle still ahead of her, she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not break. She would not confess. She would maintain her innocence and her dignity, no matter what additional humiliations the system devised for her.
Elena didn't know it yet, but her decision to resist, to maintain her truth in the face of systematic attempts to destroy it, would soon be validated in ways she couldn't have imagined. The threads that Captain Chen had been pulling were beginning to unravel the conspiracy against her, and General Hayes's investigation was uncovering evidence that would expose the real traitors.
But for now, Elena could only endure and hope that somewhere, someone was working to uncover the truth. She had been stripped of her rank, her uniform, her hair, and her freedom. But she still possessed the most important things: her integrity, her courage, and her unshakable belief in her own innocence. These were the things that could not be taken from her, no matter what the system tried to do. 6 months into her ordeal, Elena had become a master of survival in the military detention system. She had learned to find dignity in the smallest victories, maintaining perfect posture during inspections, keeping her cell spotless despite having almost nothing to organize, and never allowing her captors to see the doubt that sometimes crept into her thoughts during the darkest hours of the night.
But on a humid Tuesday morning in July, everything began to change when Captain Chen arrived for their scheduled meeting, with an expression Elena had never seen before. He was trying to contain his excitement, but Elena could read the hope in his eyes, like a message written in a language only she understood.
After months of setbacks and seemingly insurmountable evidence, Chen had finally found the crack in the prosecution's case that would begin their journey toward the truth. Elena sat across from Chen in the sterile conference room that had become as familiar as her cell.
The metal table between them was scratched and worn from countless similar meetings between lawyers and their clients, each mark a testament to other lives that had been ground down by the military justice system. Chen placed a thick folder on the table with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence that could change everything.
"Elena, I need you to stay calm while I tell you what we've discovered," Chen began, his voice betraying the significance of what he was about to reveal. "Miguel has been conducting his own investigation, and he's found something that could blow this entire case apart."
Elena felt her heart racing but forced herself to maintain the composure she had learned was essential for survival in this environment. After months of disappointment and false hopes, she had trained herself not to get too excited about potential breakthroughs. But something in Chen's demeanor suggested this was different from the minor inconsistencies they had been chasing for months. Chen opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. The papers looked innocuous enough: standard military communications and scheduling forms that could be found in any base administrative office. But Chen's finger traced specific dates and times that, when connected, told a story that contradicted the prosecution's timeline in crucial ways. Miguel discovered that Colonel Brennan made several unauthorized access attempts to classified communication systems in the 3 weeks leading up to your mission, Chen explained, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private from the monitoring systems. The access logs show him viewing operational plans and communication protocols that were well outside his need-to-know parameters. Elena studied the documents, her training in intelligence analysis allowing her to quickly understand the significance of what she was seeing. The timestamp showed a pattern of activity that aligned perfectly with when the false evidence against her would have been created. More importantly, Brennan's access to these systems would have given him everything he needed to construct convincing fake communications that appeared to come from her accounts. "There's more," Chen continued, pulling out another set of papers. "The financial records that supposedly show payments to you?" Miguel traced the account numbers back through several shell companies,
The money originated from accounts that Brennan had access to through his position on the Base Procurement Oversight Committee.
Elena felt a rush of vindication so powerful it left her breathless. After months of having her integrity questioned, her patriotism challenged, and her very sanity doubted, here was concrete proof that she had been framed.
The evidence was technical and complex, requiring careful explanation to be understood, but it was also irrefutable. Brennan had been systematically building a case against her while simultaneously creating the very crimes for which she was being prosecuted.
But even as Elena absorbed this life-changing information, she knew that their fight was far from over. Proving Brennan's guilt would be almost as difficult as proving her innocence had been. The military hierarchy was designed to protect high-ranking officers from accusations by their subordinates, and Brennan had spent years building relationships and accumulating favors that would make him difficult to challenge directly.
Chen seemed to read her thoughts. I know what you're thinking, and you're right. This evidence is enough to create reasonable doubt about your guilt, but proving Brennan's involvement is going to require more than access logs and financial records.
We need someone with the authority and credibility to validate our findings and demand a full investigation.
Elena's mind immediately went to General Hayes, her mentor, who had been reassigned to Washington just before her arrest. Hayes had the rank, the reputation, and the personal knowledge of Elena's character to make their accusations credible.
But Elena also knew that involving Hayes would put her mentor's own career at risk. Challenging a colonel's integrity, even with evidence, could backfire catastrophically if the military hierarchy chose to protect Brennan.
What does Miguel think about approaching General Hayes? Elena asked, knowing that her brother's position within the military gave him insights into the political realities they were facing. Chen's expression became more serious.
Actually, Elena, that brings me to the other thing I need to tell you. Miguel has been walking a very fine line with his investigation.
His commanding officer has started asking questions about his research activities, and there's a possibility he could face disciplinary action for interfering with an ongoing court-martial case. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow.
The thought that her brother might face punishment for trying to help her was almost worse than her own situation. Miguel had a promising military career ahead of him, and Elena couldn't bear the idea that his loyalty to her might destroy his future.
She had already cost too many good soldiers too much. Elena's resolve hardened as she contemplated the choice before them.
They could play it safe, use the evidence they had to create reasonable doubt and hope for an acquittal, while allowing the real perpetrators to escape justice. Or they could take the greater risk of exposing the entire conspiracy, knowing that failure would likely result in harsher sentences for Elena and career destruction for everyone who had tried to help her.
"David, I need you to understand something," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her an effective leader in combat situations. "I didn't survive 6 months in this place just to accept a compromise that lets the people who betrayed my soldiers walk free.
We're going to pursue this investigation wherever it leads, regardless of the risks to any of us." Chen nodded, having expected this response from Elena. During their months of working together, he had come to understand that she was constitutionally incapable of accepting injustice, even when fighting it might cost her everything. It was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. Elena's determination to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. Word of Miguel's investigation had reached Colonel Brennan through channels Elena and Chen didn't know existed. Brennan realized that his carefully constructed frame-up was beginning to unravel, and he began taking steps to protect himself and eliminate the threat to his position. 3 days after Elena's meeting with Chen, Miguel Rodriguez disappeared.
Elena learned of her brother's disappearance during what should have been a routine legal consultation. Chen arrived at the detention facility with an expression of barely controlled panic, accompanied by 2 military police officers whose presence indicated that something serious had happened.
Elena was escorted to the conference room under heavier guard than usual, and she knew before anyone spoke that her world was about to become even more complicated. "Elena, I need you to stay calm," Chen began, using the same words he had used to deliver good news just days earlier. But his tone now carried dread instead of hope. "Miguel has been reported as absent without leave from his duty station. He missed formation this morning, and his quarters appear to have been hastily vacated."
Elena felt the room spinning around her. Miguel would never go AWOL voluntarily.
His commitment to military service was absolute, inherited from the same family values that had driven Elena's own career. If Miguel was missing, it meant either something terrible had happened to him, or he had been forced to run to protect himself from retaliation for his investigation. The military police officers, Major Williams and Lieutenant Santos, took over the conversation with the professional detachment of people delivering bad news according to established protocol. Elena was informed that Miguel's disappearance was being treated as a possible desertion, which could result in additional charges against Elena for conspiracy or for encouraging his illegal actions. Elena's composure, carefully maintained through months of psychological pressure, finally began to crack. The thought that her fight to prove her innocence might have resulted in harm to Miguel was more devastating than anything the system had done to her directly.
She had endured every humiliation, accepted every indignity, maintained her resistance through the darkest hours, but the possibility that her brother might have paid the price for her stubborn refusal to confess was almost unbearable. But even as Elena struggled with guilt and fear for her brother's safety, she forced herself to think strategically about what his disappearance meant for their investigation.
If Miguel had been forced to run, he had probably taken evidence with him. If he had been silenced in some other way, the evidence might have been destroyed. Either scenario suggested that their investigation had been getting close to something important enough to justify extreme measures to stop it. Chen was thinking along the same lines. After the military police officers left, he leaned across the table and spoke in a whisper that wouldn't be picked up by the room's monitoring systems.
Elena, Miguel's disappearance might actually prove that we're on the right track. If Brennan felt secure in his position, he wouldn't need to take such drastic action.
Elena nodded, but her concern for Miguel's safety overshadowed any tactical considerations. She needed to know what had happened to her brother, and she needed to find a way to protect him if he was still alive and in hiding. The investigation that had seemed like their path to freedom had suddenly become a deadly game, with stakes higher than Elena had imagined. Unknown to Elena, Miguel was indeed alive and in hiding. He had received warning from an unexpected source that his investigation had been discovered and that he was in immediate danger. The warning had come from Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, an intelligence analyst who had been monitoring communications related to Elena's case. Santos had noticed unusual activity in the secure communication systems. Activity that suggested someone was tracking Miguel's research and preparing to neutralize the threat he represented. Miguel had barely escaped from his quarters before a team of Brennan's allies arrived to arrest him on fabricated charges. He was now hiding at a safe house established by a network of soldiers who had begun to doubt the official story about Elena's guilt. This network, led by Santos and including several of Elena's former subordinates, had been conducting their own informal investigation into the charges against their respected former commander. The existence of this network was evidence that Elena's reputation and character had made a lasting impression on the soldiers she had led. Despite the official narrative that painted her as a traitor, many of the men and women who had served under her command refused to believe the charges. They remembered the officer who had risked her life to save wounded soldiers, who had ensured that her troops had proper equipment and training, who had treated every person under her command with respect and dignity, regardless of their rank or background. Elena's case had become a symbol of something larger within the military community. Soldiers who had never met her personally began to see her situation as a test of whether the military justice system could be trusted to protect innocent people against false accusations. The fact that someone with Elena's exemplary record could be destroyed so thoroughly by unsubstantiated charges raised uncomfortable questions about the vulnerability of any soldier who might run afoul of powerful interests. General Hayes had been monitoring Elena's case from her position in Washington, using her security clearance and political connections to gather intelligence that wasn't available to Elena's defense team. What Hayes discovered corroborated the evidence Miguel had uncovered and pointed to a conspiracy that extended beyond Colonel Brennan to include several other high-ranking officers who had been profiting from illicit arms sales to the same enemy forces Elena was accused of aiding. Hayes realized that Elena had been framed not just to destroy her career, but to cover up a much larger operation that had been funneling weapons and intelligence to insurgent groups. Elena's mission had been deliberately compromised because her unit had gotten too close to discovering the real arms trafficking network. The deaths of Elena's soldiers hadn't been an unfortunate consequence of her alleged treason. They had been intentional murders committed to protect a criminal conspiracy. The scope of the conspiracy explained why the evidence against Elena had been so comprehensive and convincing. The conspirators had access to the highest levels of military intelligence and operational planning. They had been able to create false evidence because they controlled the very systems that were supposed to detect such fabrications. Elena hadn't just been fighting for her own innocence. She had been standing in the way of a criminal enterprise that threatened national security on a scale she had never imagined. Hayes faced a difficult decision about how to proceed with her knowledge. She could work through official channels, but that would alert the conspirators and give them time to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. She could approach Elena's defense team directly, but that would compromise her own position and might not provide the legal protection the evidence would need to be admissible in court. Hayes decided to take a third option. She would use her position to gather more evidence while simultaneously preparing to provide protection for Elena, Miguel,
and the other soldiers who had been working to expose the truth. It was a dangerous strategy that could destroy her own career, but Hayes had not forgotten the oath she had taken to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Elena remained unaware of the larger forces aligning either for or against her. From her cell in the detention facility, she could only react to the immediate crises and hope that her faith in the truth would eventually be vindicated. The news of Miguel's disappearance had shaken her more deeply than anything else she had endured, but it had also clarified her sense of purpose.
Elena realized that her fight was no longer just about clearing her own name or even about getting justice for the soldiers who had died in the ambush. Her brother's disappearance proved that the conspiracy against her was willing to target anyone who threatened their operations.
If she gave up now, if she accepted a plea bargain, or stopped fighting the charges, Miguel and everyone else who had tried to help her would remain in danger. Elena's cell had become her command post, the place where she planned her strategy for the legal and political battle that would determine not just her fate, but the safety of everyone she cared about. She had been stripped of her uniform, her rank, and her freedom, but she still possessed the strategic thinking and leadership instincts that had made her an effective officer. Each morning, Elena would review everything she knew about the case, looking for new connections and possibilities that might have been overlooked. Each evening, she would plan the next day's approach to working with Chen and coordinating with the allies she hoped were still working on her behalf. The routine gave structure to her days and purpose to her resistance. Elena's transformation during her months in detention had been dramatic. The confident officer who had been arrested had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, and more determined than she had ever been before. The system had tried to break her spirit by taking away everything that defined her identity, but instead it had revealed the core of strength that no external force could touch. When Elena looked in the mirror now, she no longer saw the defeated prisoner that Colonel Mitchell had intended to create. She saw a soldier who had been tested by fire and found unbreakable. The shaved head that was supposed to symbolize her humiliation had become a badge of honor, proof that she had endured the worst the system could inflict while maintaining her integrity and her commitment to the truth. Elena was no longer fighting just to prove her innocence. She was fighting to expose a conspiracy that threatened everything she believed in about military service and national security. She was fighting for Miguel, and for all the soldiers whose lives had been destroyed by people who had betrayed the very oath they had sworn to uphold. The woman who had once been Captain Elena Rodriguez was gone, destroyed by false accusations and systematic psychological pressure. In her place stood someone new, someone who understood the true nature of the battle she was fighting and who possessed the courage to see it through to its conclusion regardless of the personal cost. Elena didn't know it yet, but her refusal to be broken, her insistence on maintaining her innocence in the face of overwhelming pressure, was about to be vindicated in ways that would shock everyone involved in her case. The cracks in the conspiracy's foundation were spreading, and soon the entire structure of lies and false evidence would come crashing down. But for now, Elena could only endure and fight, sustained by the knowledge that somewhere out there, people who believed in her were working to uncover the truth. The hardest part of her ordeal was almost over, but the most dangerous part was just beginning. 7 months into Elena's imprisonment, the military detention facility received an unexpected visitor, whose arrival would shatter the carefully constructed web of lies that had destroyed Elena's life. General Patricia Hayes had returned from Washington not as a routine visitor, but as the head of a classified investigation that had been authorized at the highest levels of the Pentagon. The scope of corruption Elena's case had exposed went far beyond a simple frame-up and threatened the security of ongoing operations across multiple theaters. Elena learned of General Hayes's arrival through the prison's rumor network, a system of whispered communications that spread news faster than official announcements. Guards who had treated Elena with contempt for months suddenly became nervous in her presence, as if they sensed that the power dynamics they had grown accustomed to were about to shift dramatically. Colonel Mitchell, who had taken such pleasure in orchestrating Elena's humiliation, now moved through the facility with the rigid bearing of someone trying to maintain control while knowing that her authority was being challenged. Elena's first indication that something significant was happening came when she was ordered to report to the facility's administrative office immediately after morning inspection. This was unusual because Elena's meetings with her legal team were scheduled well in advance and always took place in the designated conference rooms. The guards escorting her seemed uncertain about proper protocol, checking their orders repeatedly and communicating through radios more frequently than normal. When Aylin arrived at the administrative office, she found herself face-to-face with General Hayes for the first time since her arrest. The reunion was emotionally overwhelming for Elena, who had spent months believing that everyone she had trusted had abandoned her. Hayes looked older than Elena remembered, her face bearing the strain of the investigation she had been conducting and the political battles she had been fighting to expose the truth.
Hayes was accompanied by a team of military investigators from the Inspector General's office, men and women whose presence indicated that Elena's case had been elevated to the highest levels of military oversight. These investigators had the authority to compel testimony from anyone, regardless of rank, and their involvement suggested that the conspiracy against Elena was about to be fully exposed.
Captain Rodriguez, General Hayes said, using Elena's rank for the first time since her arrest, "I want you to know that we have uncovered evidence that completely exonerates you of all charges. Moreover, we have identified the real conspirators and the scope of their criminal activities."
You are no longer a suspect in this case. You are a victim.
Elena felt her knees go weak at hearing these words. After months of maintaining her innocence in the face of seemingly overwhelming evidence, after enduring humiliation and psychological torture designed to break her will, she was finally being vindicated. But even as relief flooded through her, Elena remained cautious. She had learned not to trust good news too quickly.
Colonel James Morrison, the lead investigator from the Inspector General's office, opened a thick briefcase and spread documents across the conference table. The evidence he displayed was far more comprehensive than anything Elena's defense team had been able to gather. Financial records, communication intercepts, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies painted a picture of corruption that stretched across multiple military installations and involved millions of dollars in illegal arms sales. "Captain Rodriguez, what we're about to show you is classified at the highest levels," Morrison explained.
Your case was the key that unlocked an investigation into one of the largest corruption scandals in recent military history. The people who framed you were protecting a criminal enterprise that threatened national security.
The documents Morrison displayed showed that Colonel Brennan had been the head of a network that included officers at 3 different bases and several civilian contractors. They had been systematically diverting military weapons and equipment to black market dealers who sold them to insurgent groups and criminal organizations.
Elena's unit had been getting close to discovering their operations during routine intelligence gathering, so they had decided to eliminate the threat by destroying Elena's credibility and career. Elena studied the evidence with growing amazement and horror.
The conspiracy against her had been even more elaborate and far-reaching than she had imagined. The false communications that had seemed to show her betraying intelligence to enemy forces had actually been created by redirecting real communications from Brennan's network. The financial records showing payments to her accounts had been generated by the same systems the conspirators used to launder money from their illegal arms sales. Morrison continued his briefing, explaining how the investigation had expanded once General Hayes had brought Elena's case to the attention of federal authorities. "Miguel's disappearance was actually a stroke of luck for our investigation," Morrison revealed. "He had gathered evidence that we needed, and his forced disappearance gave us probable cause for surveillance warrants that exposed the entire network." Elena felt a mixture of relief and anger at learning that Miguel was safe and had been working with federal investigators. Relief because her brother was alive and protected. Anger because she had spent weeks believing that her fight for justice had destroyed his career and possibly his life. But Elena also understood that Miguel's apparent disappearance had been necessary to protect him from retaliation and to allow the investigation to proceed without alerting the conspirators. General Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious as she addressed the deeper implications of what Elena had endured. "Elena, I need you to understand that your refusal to confess, your insistence on maintaining your innocence even under extreme pressure, was crucial to exposing this conspiracy. It didn't come to a Soviet's conspiracy. If you had broken down and confessed to crimes you didn't commit, these criminals would have continued operating and more soldiers would have died." Elena absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated that her stubborn resistance had served a larger purpose, but another part of her was horrified to learn that her personal ordeal had been allowed to continue for months while investigators gathered evidence against the real criminals. She understood the necessity of the strategy, but the knowledge that her suffering had been prolonged deliberately was difficult to accept. Morrison addressed Elena's unspoken concerns. "Captain, I know this is hard to hear, but your situation was so carefully constructed by the conspirators that we needed time to unravel all the false evidence and build an ironclad case against them. Any premature action on our part would have allowed them to destroy evidence and escape prosecution." Elena nodded, accepting the explanation even as she struggled with its implications. She had learned during her months in detention that justice often required sacrifices that seemed unfair to the individuals involved. The important thing now was that the truth had been exposed and the real criminals would face consequences for their actions. The briefing continued with Morrison explaining the legal process that would follow. Elena would be released immediately and all charges against her would be dropped. She would be reinstated to her previous rank with back pay and full military honors.
The officers who had conspired against her would face court-martial proceedings on charges that included treason, conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. But Elena's vindication came with complications that reflected the political sensitivities surrounding her case. The military hierarchy was embarrassed by how thoroughly they had been deceived by the false evidence against Elena. The fact that an innocent officer had been subjected to months of psychological torture while the real criminals remained free raised uncomfortable questions about the reliability of military justice procedures. Elena would be offered the choice of returning to active duty or accepting a medical retirement with full benefits. Either option came with the understanding that her case would remain classified and that she would be expected to maintain discretion about the details of what had happened to her. The military wanted to control the narrative around her vindication to minimize damage to their institutional reputation. Elena listened to these explanations with growing unease. She understood the military's desire to limit the political fallout from her case. But she also felt that the full truth about what had happened deserved to be told. The soldiers who had died because of the conspiracy, the families who had suffered because of false accusations, and the military personnel who had risked their careers to help her all deserved recognition for their sacrifices. General Hayes seemed to understand Elena's concerns. "Elena, I know you're thinking about the broader implications of what happened here. We'll have time to discuss how to handle those issues properly. Right now, the most important thing is getting you out of this place and beginning your recovery from what you've endured."
Elena's release from detention was surreal after months of imprisonment.
The guards who had treated her with contempt and cruelty now spoke to her with forced respect, aware that their previous behavior toward an innocent officer might have consequences for their own careers. Colonel Mitchell was notably absent from the facility during Elena's departure, having suddenly taken emergency leave when news of the investigation broke. Elena's personal belongings, which had been confiscated during her initial processing, were returned to her in a sealed bag. The watch from her father, the cross from her mother, and other small items that had represented her connection to her identity before this nightmare began. But as Elena handled these familiar objects, she realized that the person who had originally owned them no longer existed. The woman leaving detention was fundamentally different from the officer who had been arrested 7 months earlier. Elena's first stop after leaving detention was a secure medical facility where she would undergo physical and psychological evaluation. The military wanted to ensure that she was fit for duty and to document any lasting effects of her imprisonment for potential legal proceedings.
But Elena also knew that this medical evaluation was part of the military's effort to control the narrative around her case by establishing an official record of her condition. The medical evaluation revealed what Elena already knew, that her months in detention had taken a physical and emotional toll that would require time and treatment to fully address.
She had lost weight, suffered from chronic sleep disturbation, and showed signs of the hypervigilance that characterized people who had been subjected to prolonged psychological pressure. But the evaluation also documented Elena's remarkable psychological resilience and her retention of the cognitive abilities that had made her an effective officer. Elena's reunion with Miguel took place in a secure conference room at the medical facility, with federal investigators present to ensure that their conversation didn't compromise ongoing prosecutions. Seeing her brother again was emotionally overwhelming for Elena, who had spent weeks believing that her fight for justice had destroyed his life. Miguel looked older and more serious than Elena remembered, marked by his own ordeal of forced disappearance and clandestine investigation. Miguel's account of what had happened to him revealed another dimension of the conspiracy against Elena.
He had been forced to disappear, not just because his investigation was getting close to the truth, but because Brennan's network had been planning to eliminate him as a potential witness. Miguel had spent months in protective custody, working with federal investigators to build the case that had finally exposed the corruption network.
"Elena, I want you to know that I never doubted your innocence," Miguel said, his voice carrying the strain of everything they had both endured. "When I started investigating your case, I expected to find evidence that would exonerate you. I didn't expect to uncover a conspiracy that went this deep or this high up the chain of command." Elena learned from Miguel that the investigation had ultimately involved multiple federal agencies, including the FBI, the DEA, and military intelligence units. The conspiracy had international dimensions, with connections to arms dealers in several countries and criminal organizations that posed threats to national security. Elena's case had been the thread that, when pulled, had unraveled a web of corruption that law enforcement agencies had been trying to penetrate for years. The scope of the investigation explained why Elena's vindication had taken so long, and why it had required such careful coordination among multiple agencies. The conspirators had been under surveillance for months while investigators mapped their entire network and gathered evidence that would ensure successful prosecutions. Elena's continued imprisonment during this time had been a necessary part of maintaining the investigation's security.
As Elena processed this information, she began to understand that her personal ordeal had been part of something much larger than a simple case of false accusations. She had unknowingly become a key figure in a major national security investigation, and her refusal to confess to crimes she hadn't committed had been crucial to the ultimate success of that investigation. Elena's first meeting with the media after her vindication was carefully orchestrated by military public affairs officers who wanted to control the narrative around her case. Elena was advised to focus on her gratitude for the thorough investigation that had cleared her name, and to avoid discussing details that might compromise ongoing prosecutions.
She was also encouraged to emphasize her commitment to continued military service and her faith in the military justice system, but Elena struggled with the constraints placed on her public statements.
She felt that the full story of what had happened to her needed to be told, not just for her own vindication, but to ensure that other innocent soldiers wouldn't face similar ordeals in the future. The military's desire to minimize political fallout from her case conflicted with Elena's sense that accountability required transparency about what had gone wrong.
Elena's public statement was brief and carefully worded, expressing gratitude for the investigation that had exposed the truth, while avoiding details that might compromise ongoing legal proceedings. But Elena's appearance at the press conference, still bearing the physical effects of her months in detention, told a story that words couldn't fully convey.
The woman speaking to the media was clearly someone who had endured significant hardship, and her dignity in the face of that adversity was more powerful than any prepared statement. The reaction to Elena's vindication was swift and politically charged.
Military reform advocates pointed to her case as evidence of systemic problems with military justice procedures. Critics of the military establishment used her ordeal to question the reliability of military prosecutions and the protection of soldiers' rights. Supporters of the military emphasized the thorough investigation that had ultimately exposed the truth and cleared Elena's name. Elena found herself at the center of political debates she had never wanted to be part of.
Her case had become a symbol for larger questions about military justice, government accountability, and the protection of innocent people caught up in complex investigations. Elena understood the importance of these debates, but she also felt that the focus on political implications sometimes overshadowed the human cost of what had happened.
Elena's decision about her future military career was complicated by the political dimensions of her case and the personal trauma she had endured. Returning to active duty would demonstrate her resilience and her continued commitment to military service, but it would also mean working within a system that had failed her so dramatically. Accepting medical retirement would allow her to recover from her ordeal and pursue civilian opportunities, but it might also be seen as an admission that the military had permanently damaged her capacity to serve. Elena ultimately decided to return to active duty, but with conditions that reflected her new understanding of how the military system operated. She would accept assignments that utilized her experience and expertise while avoiding positions that might put her in conflict with the political considerations that had complicated her case. She would also work within appropriate channels to advocate for reforms that would prevent other soldiers from facing similar ordeals. Elena's return to active duty was marked by a formal ceremony that recognized her vindication and honored her resilience during her months of wrongful imprisonment. General Hayes presided over the ceremony, using the occasion to acknowledge the failures that had led to Elena's ordeal while also celebrating the investigation that had ultimately exposed the truth. The ceremony was attended by many of the soldiers who had served under Elena's command and who had never believed the charges against her. For Elena, seeing these men and women again was both gratifying and emotional. Their continued faith in her character had sustained her during the darkest periods of her imprisonment, and their presence at her vindication ceremony represented a validation that meant more than any official recognition. Elena's new assignment would take her to a position in military intelligence, where her experience with corruption investigations and her understanding of security vulnerabilities would be valuable assets. The assignment was also designed to keep her away from operational commands where political considerations might complicate her effectiveness as a leader. As Elena prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed over the past months. She had entered this ordeal as a competent officer who believed in the fundamental fairness of military institutions. She was emerging as someone who understood the complexity of those institutions and the ways they could fail the very people they were supposed to protect. Elena's experience had taught her that integrity and courage were necessary but not sufficient for navigating complex institutional challenges. She had also learned the importance of allies who were willing to risk their own positions to support the truth, and the value of persistence in the face of seemingly overwhelming opposition. Elena's story was far from over. Her vindication had cleared her name and exposed a dangerous conspiracy, but it had also revealed systemic vulnerabilities that threatened other soldiers and military operations. Elena would spend the rest of her career working to address those vulnerabilities, while honoring the memory of the soldiers who had died because of the corruption she had unwittingly uncovered. The woman who had been broken down and built back up during 7 months of wrongful imprisonment was no longer the same person who had been arrested on false charges. Elena had been transformed by her ordeal into someone stronger, more aware, and more determined to ensure that the military lived up to its highest ideals. Her journey through injustice had prepared her for the battles that lay ahead, in ways that no amount of conventional training ever could. 2 years after her vindication, Elena Rodriguez had rebuilt her military career and established herself as one of the Army's most respected intelligence officers. Her experience with the corruption scandal had given her unique insights into security vulnerabilities and institutional failures that made her invaluable to military leadership. She had been promoted to major and was being considered for assignments that would put her on track for eventual command positions.
But Elena's life was about to take another dramatic turn when a routine assignment revealed a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her own identity. Elena was working late in her office at Fort Bragg, reviewing intelligence reports from overseas operations, when she received a call that would shatter her understanding of her past.
General Patricia Hayes, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, requested an immediate secure video conference. The urgency in Hayes' voice suggested something more significant than routine military business.
Elena had maintained regular contact with General Hayes since her vindication, viewing her former mentor as both a professional guide and a personal friend. Hayes had been instrumental in Elena's recovery and career rehabilitation, providing advice and support that had helped Elena navigate the complex political landscape of military service after such a public ordeal.
Elena trusted Hayes completely and had never questioned the depth of their professional relationship. The secure video conference began routinely, with Hayes briefing Elena on a new assignment that would take her to the Pentagon.
As part of an intelligence analysis unit working on counterterrorism operations.
It was a prestigious assignment that would advance Elena's career and utilize her hard-earned expertise in corruption investigation and security analysis. Elena was honored by the opportunity and eager to take on the new challenges it would present.
But as the conversation continued, Hayes' demeanor shifted from professional to personal in a way that caught Elena's attention. Hayes seemed to be struggling with something, choosing her words carefully and pausing in ways that suggested she was debating how much to reveal.
Elena had learned to read people carefully during her ordeal, and she sensed that Hayes was building up to something significant. "Elena, there's something else I need to discuss with you," Hayes began, her voice taking on a tone Elena had never heard before.
"Something personal that will affect your new assignment, and that you have a right to know before you accept it." Elena felt a familiar unease, the same instinct that had served her well during her months in detention when she had learned not to trust unexpected revelations. But this was General Hayes, the person who had saved her career and possibly her life.
Elena couldn't imagine what personal matter could be so significant that it would affect a professional assignment. Hayes took a deep breath before continuing, her usual command presence replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. "Elena, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels and known to only a few people in the military hierarchy. It concerns your family history and your relationship to certain military personnel."
Elena's mind raced through possibilities, but nothing in her family history seemed relevant to military classifications or personnel relationships. Her parents were hardworking immigrants with no military connections. Miguel was a staff sergeant with a conventional career path. Elena couldn't understand what Hayes was building up to reveal. "Elena, I want you to know that I've been following your career since before you knew I existed," Hayes continued. "Not because of your exceptional performance, though that has been remarkable, but because of a personal connection that I've never been able to acknowledge publicly." Elena felt her world beginning to shift as Hayes' words sank in. The careful way Hayes was speaking, the emotional undertone in her voice, and the classified nature of what she was about to reveal, all suggested something far more significant than Elena had imagined. Elena forced herself to remain calm and wait for Hayes to continue. Hayes looked directly into the camera, her expression mixing professional determination with personal emotion. "Elena, I am your biological mother. You were born Patricia Elena Rodriguez Hayes 29 years ago, and I made the most difficult decision of my life when I gave you up for adoption to protect both your future and my military career."
Elena felt the world stop spinning as Hayes' words registered.
Everything she had believed about her identity, her family, and her relationship to the woman who had mentored and protected her was suddenly revealed to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding.
The woman she had respected as a mentor and trusted as a friend was actually the mother who had given birth to her and then disappeared from her life, before Elena was old enough to remember. Elena's mind struggled to process this revelation while Hayes continued her explanation. I was a young lieutenant when I became pregnant with you.
The father was a fellow officer who was killed in a training accident before I could tell him about you. I was facing a choice between ending my military career to raise you or finding you a home where you could have the stable family life that my career wouldn't allow me to provide.
Elena listened in stunned silence as Hayes described the circumstances that had led to her adoption. Hayes had researched potential adoptive families carefully, looking for people who shared her values and who would provide Elena with opportunities for education and personal growth.
The Rodriguez family had been chosen because of their strong commitment to family and their dreams of providing their children with better opportunities than they had experienced. Hayes had maintained distant monitoring of Elena's development through unofficial channels, ensuring that she was thriving in her adoptive home while never interfering with the family relationships Elena was building. When Elena enlisted in the military, Hayes had been both proud and concerned, knowing that military service would eventually bring Elena into environments where their paths might cross. When you came to my attention as a promising young officer, I faced another difficult decision, Hayes continued. They took her hair to crush her spirit, until a general revealed her true rank.